Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Jim Dow, editorial page editor. If it's an important slice of American history, you can bet Ken Burns has made a documentary about it. The list is nearly endless. From baseball to jazz, Mark Twain to Ernest Hemingway, the Civil War to the Dust Bowl. Now he's going back to the beginning with an exploration of the Revolutionary War, a war that is also celebrating its 250th anniversary this year. I'm joined by Ken Burns in the Globe studio now. Welcome, Ken. So good to have you.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So when I learned about your project, I was almost surprised to learn that you hadn't already made a revolutionary series. You've covered so many chapters of American history. You hadn't covered the first chapter, really. Why did that not happen earlier?
There's lots of reasons, I guess. One is after the Civil War series came out, I said I'd never do another war again. But at the end of the 90s, 10 years after the Civil War came out, I just realized that all these veterans of the Second World War were dying. A lot of school kids thought we fought with the Germans against the Russians. So I sort of said, okay, no nevers. And we spent, nearly 8 years working on a history of that. Before the ink was dry on the war, as we called it, about the Second World War, I said, we're doing Vietnam. And before the ink was dry, I said on that film in 2015, I said, we're doing the revolution. It was just really gut instincts about where to follow the trail. We've done lots of other films, and war is incredibly revealing. So I'm glad I waited. I've covered the war in earlier films in the history of the Shakers, briefly in Thomas Jefferson in 97. The Shakers were in the early 80s. But it represents huge filmmaking challenges. There's not a single photograph, obviously, or a newsreel, obviously. So how are you going to recalibrate all of our stuff? There's no living witnesses, obviously. So how do you intermix a technique I've used for years of first-person voices and third-person narrator, commentary of scholars and writers and other people who know about it? But what do you do about bringing it to life? Lots of maps. We filmed reenactors, not with an idea of directing them, per se, but filming what they did in this very impressionistic way. So you get a sense, a haze, an out of focus, an arm, a hand, blood on a floor, a bayonet going through some smoke that we could just follow and collect almost as documentary. So we feel sort of our anxieties have been a little bit assuaged as we work on a film for a decade and try to get a super complex story done. So I think, maybe it's maturing as a filmmaker, willing to take on how complex the revolution is. And it's complex because we've ignored a lot about it. We've just assumed that it's been bloodless and gallant and about big ideas and guys signing documents in Philadelphia. It's much more interesting and complicated than that. And that's, I think, what our team, and it isn't me, my co-directors, Sarah Botstein and David Schmidt, the writer, Jeff Ward, and a whole, couple dozen people who really handmade this film over the last, 10 years.
Of all the many things you learned in the process of making this film over those many years, what really stands out as surprising to you about this chapter of American history that we all learned about as kids?
I think coming to understand the undertow and the contradictions of it did not in any way diminish it the way revisionism sometimes seems to do. It seems to erode a faith in something. The right kind of, not revisionism, but revisiting of the complexity actually adds dimension to it. Jefferson has this line in the Declaration that's rarely quoted. All experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. He said that there were some self-evident truths a few sentences before. They're not self-evident at all. What he's saying is that everybody has been under an authoritarian boot, and we've accepted it. Mankind has shown, it's easier to suffer the evils, and that he was creating something else. The founders were creating something else. This movement, this revolution was going to create not subjects, but citizens with all the requirements and responsibilities and all the anxieties. John Adams is always worried, is there enough virtue? Is there too much ambition and avarice that we're going to be able to pull this off? It requires this dedicated stuff. So that what happens is that when you tell a more complete story about it that sees it as it was, a very violent civil war, in addition to a revolution, the first that ever proclaimed the inalienable rights of all people, it's actually more inspiriting. The ideas get bigger
Mm.
if your knee-jerk patriotism isn't checked by the complexities of it.
Well, on that score, is there is there a particular complexity that really stands out to you when you just like your mind is wandering and you think back to something that stands out in what you
Well,
learned?
I think it's just that we have, when you say the revolution, there's a distance, right? Because it's not a photograph. They don't seem real the way a Civil War body or a president seems like a real person. They're in wigs, they're paintings, they're subject to the talent or lack of talent of the painter. They're in stockings and breeches. And so there's a kind of distance from them. But once you have found a way to sort of communicate a humanness to them, then all of a sudden you get a huge rush of the complexity of it, and you begin to add all the different elements. This is a global war, and it involves more than 24 nations, European, but also Native Americans. There's a fifth of the population is enslaved. A good deal of the population is loyalist throughout. I mean, it's so complex. Women are not silent partners in this. They're active. They're vocal. They keep the resistance alive. And so I think that we just tell a kind of idealized, sort of take the cream off the top and say it's only about this, and if you mix it with the rest of the stuff, it's going to destroy it. And it doesn't. It just makes it so much more interesting and so much more complicated.
You said that this history, your version of this history is not just about the document signers. It's about the regular people who participated in the war too. Tell us an example of that.
I'll tell you lots of examples. It's very, very important. I mean, even the idea that we could form a union is inspired by the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy of first 5 and then later 6 tribes that formed together that had a functioning democracy for them, giving autonomy to each tribe, but also banding together in mutual interests, in which Benjamin Franklin is incredibly impressed by this. So there's a Native American dimension, not just on the frontier, not just at the edges, not with just the raids and the counter raids, but involved in every one of the colonies you would see. We follow a 14-year-old fifer who joins the Patriot cause in Cambridge, trying to get back to Boston to find his parents. And he's, a very important character in our film, as is Joseph Plum Martin, who's sort of well known among scholars as a 15-year-old kid from Connecticut who joins and fights throughout the war. We have a 10-year-old gal named Betsy Ambler, 10 when the war began, 16 or so when it ends, that narrates her own family's struggles at this vulnerable place. And they're refugees for most of the war, fleeing Yorktown and its vulnerability to British ships.
And is there one of those regular folks that stands out to you?
Well, I think Joseph Plum Martin, who I've mentioned, Betsy Ambler. There's a loyalist named John Peters, who is like the most respected citizen in his Vermont territory. It's an area contested by both New England and New York. It's not yet a state, of course. And they send him because he's the most respected to the Continental Congress. And he gets there and he goes, the first Continental Congress goes, "What? You're up to this?" No. And he goes home. He's arrested 4 times along the way at Wethersfield, at Hartford, at Springfield. And then when he gets home, his father insists that he get a severe bruising from his fellow townspeople. He's eventually driven out of there, abandoning his wife and small, including infant children. She eventually is driven out and has to make her way somehow by hook or by crook in the winter to Lake Champlain, where she's picked up by a British patrol boat, and they reunited up in Quebec. He starts a regiment. His 15-year-old son is the first person to sign up. He comes back and at the Battle of Bennington kills his best friend growing up in New Haven.
Oh, my.
So, and we follow him through. He's a loyalist to the end. He ends up having to leave. He settles with his wife Anne in Nova Scotia, and that's the fate of many, many loyalists who choose to leave rather than live under the victors. And so there's an intimacy, and there's no judgment either. You understand why someone would be a loyalist. It's what we'd call conservative. You've seen the prosperity that the British form of government, it's constitutional monarchy, and we're going to throw in our lots of these people who are suggesting something even more radical than that. I'm doing fine, thank you very much. No. And feel strong enough about it to raise regiments and to fight, and in many cases give up their lives.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we're in the heart of Revolutionary War history here in Boston, obviously. The old State House is right across the street, and that includes a memorial to the 5 men who were killed by the British soldiers in what's now known as the Boston Massacre 255 years ago. Talk a little bit about how Boston is situated in the story you tell, and why do you think it was so central to the revolutionary movement?
Well, there's protests going on everywhere. Certainly Virginia, the most populous and the most well-to-do, along with South Carolina of the colonies. We have to remember the 13 are the least profitable of the 26 colonies that Britain has in North America. The ones in the East Indies, where it's so dependent on slave labor, 90% in Barbados or Jamaica. Those are the profit centers. But we manufacture things. We're a good trading partner. We buy things. Massachusetts is the least profitable because it has the fewest number of slaves in it.
Oh.
The most profitable are Virginia and South Carolina because they have the most slaves. So it tells you already a dynamic at work in the economic dynamics of this, as well as in the human and moral dynamics of slavery. So what's happening is we're upset that the British aren't letting us take Indian land. We're upset that certain taxes are being levied on us. We're the least taxed people. Colonist pays a shilling, and the average Englander pays 26 shillings a year. And so the British naturally say, hey, we got the most far-flung empire on earth, and our treasury's empty. So there's all of this stuff. And New England is one of the most vociferous places. One of the big reasons is they have a guy who's a propagandist, Samuel Adams. He's a failure as a brewer and a collector of customs, I think it was. But he is really good at keeping people, as he said, alive to their grievances. Sound familiar? And so he's, even when we succeed in getting the Stamp Act revoked, it hasn't even gone into effect, he's saying, no, it's still really bad. It's still really bad. And so you have this area. Some of the laws that the British passed, like the Sugar Act, essentially is an attempt to curtail smuggling, which New England, maybe not wanting to admit it, is incredibly dependent upon, particularly Boston, particularly the wealthiest person in Boston, John Hancock. So you've got lots of conflicting things, but it's interesting that these agreeances between Englishmen are suddenly parsed out as natural rights, not just British rights. And so all of a sudden you're talking about big ideas. When it goes to that phase, then the rhetoric takes off. And the more the British accuse us of being rebels and radical, the more radical and rebellious we become. The more tyrannical we accuse them, the more tyrannical they become, until on April 19th, 1775, in Lexington Town Green, it comes out to murder, and it's a slaughter. It's a massacre, just like the Boston Massacre in 1770.
We were talking about Sam Adams a second ago, and I'm curious about how he was viewed at his own time. Was he a bold-faced name, or was he one of those people that just sort of emerged because he was such a brilliant propagandist?
Yes and yes. He's a brilliant propagandist, and because of that, he is well known. And of course, because he's writing in pretty clear prose that everybody can understand, and we're really well-read populace, and people share newspapers. A little town in New Hampshire I live in had its own Gazette, which was read in Georgia, and people exchanged ideas. There were committees of correspondence that kept the issues alive, first in the colony of Massachusetts, and then later on throughout the 13 colonies that had this free flow of ideas. So he would have been really well known. He takes a back seat. So Boston is central, obviously, throughout our first episode and through to the end of our second episode, where the Declaration is signed. But before that, Henry Knox has brought the guns from Ticonderoga that Ethan Allen and one of our great generals, Benedict Arnold, have gotten, and he brings them. And by the time they get put up in the heights of Dorchester, the British look up and go, "We're out of here," and we retreat to Nova Scotia. At that point, the story moves to the beginning of the second movement of this 3-movement symphony of violence and great ideas, moves to the Mid-Atlantic states, particularly New York and New Jersey, as well as Pennsylvania, and then again moves to the far deep South, Georgia, and works its way through the Carolinas, ending in the climax in Virginia with the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown.
Can we talk a moment about music? It plays a big role in just about all the films you make. When I think about Revolutionary Era War, I think of fifes and drums.
We got some.
And you got some of those. I'm sure you've got a lot of those. But it sounds like you've also sort of developed a soundtrack that goes well beyond that.
Well beyond that. And so you just think about all the layers of humanity that's present in this story. There's lots of Baroque music that's inherited not just from England, that's played here. People have pianos. People are playing harpsichords. There's that. There's the Native American music. There is, of course, fife and drum, the banjo, which was a gorded African African instrument is very important. And so we wanted to represent all of that. We also wanted to find music that just fit and worked. I mean, music is, as Wynton Marsalis says, the only art that's invisible, and it's the one that works the fastest. A couple notes, and you could be in tears sometimes. And so there's a centrality to music. In fact, all of the language we use in the editing room is using musical analogy. Can I hold that another beat, another measure? Can you do this? And we're dealing with notes. Sometimes I'm taking 2 frames off something. That's a 12th of a second. And we really can actually perceive that. So we've collected a lot of things. We've worked with the country music player, Rhiannon Giddens, before. There's a wonderful woman named Jennifer Kreisberg who does Native American music. Johnny Gandelsman, who is one of the sort of organizers of the Silk Road Ensemble and an extraordinary musician in his own right, has interpreted songs of the period and other things for us. We have another composer named Dave Sierra we've worked with for 15 years that has provided us with material. I picked out 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, before I started working on this, I heard a stray song by Natalie McMaster called Hector the Hero, something that was written in the 19th century. It was just beautiful. I said, that's going to be the theme for the American Revolution. And it is. And there are other variations on it that we use and that Johnny has developed and other people have played, including Yo-Yo Ma has played this for us. And Rhiannon has taken, fortunately, Amazing Grace was written before the Revolution. And so there's versions of this that have, sort of percussive and polyphonic dimensions to it and chants and grunts. And so there's lots of music that sort of feels like us. Both, the 2-letter lowercase plural pronoun, but also the U.S.
More of my conversation with Ken Burns after a short break. So you started this project a decade ago, I think, right? And so I'm sure you had no sense that you'd be releasing it in the first year of Donald Trump's second term as president. So this has been a year when many aspects of America's culture, its history, its roots, its democracy itself have been called into question. Has the tumult of this year changed the way you think about the nation's origins at all?
No, not at all. In fact, we would be bad filmmakers, or we would be different kinds of filmmakers. We would be advocating a certain political posture. We're calling balls and strikes. That's our main desire to do. And so we know whenever we finish any film, we lift it up and see the way it's rhyming with the present. But we don't adjust in any way for that. We've got a story to tell. We think that stories are the way to overcome the binary, and there's nothing binary in nature, right? And an argument is just binary. It's on and off. It's a 1 or a 0. It's completely part of this sort of separated age that we live in. The novelist Richard Powers says the best arguments in the world won't change a single person's point of view. And so this is important to us to never sort of say that somehow what's ever going on. We began this in the beginning of at the end of the next to the last year of Barack Obama's presidency. And I didn't think about that when I chose it. And I didn't think that there would be a 250 celebration. Never even occurred to me. But we've got a really complex story to tell.
So what's a rhyme that you hear between this era now and the Revolutionary?
Well, there's a failed invasion of Canada in our film. There's a big debate about inoculations in our film. We're obviously dealing with, arguments about ways of government and what works and the very nature of democracy, the foundation of democracy. So all of those things rhyme. Mark Twain is supposed to have said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. All of them rhymes, but they're neither here nor there. They don't affect what our story is and what we're presenting. And so each individual will have to discover that. They'll hear something and they'll go, oh, that reminds me of something that this happened. Everybody will find purchase in this film if they choose to do us the extraordinary gesture of giving their attention to us for 12 hours.
You said on a couple of occasions that this revolution may have been the most important event in human civilization since the birth of Christ. Why? Tell us why.
Wars are really common. I think there's always wars going on, but this is the first proclaiming the unalienable rights of all people. Everybody to that point had been a subject. Now we are inventing a new thing called a citizen, an extraordinary privilege, which the founders worried about. It rippled out from the United States. It's changed things. It's for 250 years been an extraordinary story of the expansion of human rights. And human history has not been about that. It's been in fits and starts. We obviously were born tolerating chattel slavery in a country that was proclaiming to the world the universal rights of all human beings. We take steps forwards and we take steps backwards. But I don't know what other event could qualify in the last 2,000 years for the centrality and the importance.
You've covered so many parts of U.S. history: baseball, jazz, Vietnam, the Civil War, FDR, Muhammad Ali, Jackie Robinson. What binds each of these topics together for you, the filmmaker?
The United States. I love my country. I love the stories of my country. And with the exception of a film that came out last fall on Leonardo da Vinci, all our subjects have been about American history in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes it's recent history like the Central Park Five. Sometimes it's distant history like the American Revolution. Sometimes it's central history like the Civil War. Sometimes it's about the Brooklyn Bridge or the Statue of Liberty. Sometimes it's biographies about the Roosevelts, as you mentioned, or Mark Twain. It's funny, I collect quilts as my hobby, and they're interesting works of art, all made by women, and all with a very difficult story to discover. And I spend all my professional life tracking down and finding the stories. And I love the unknowability of looking at a quilt. I've got more than 100 of them. They're spectacular works of American art. And so I see the films as, some are bigger squares, some are smaller squares, but they contribute to the dynamics of understanding who we are. I mean, that's basically the main question that each film asks is, who are we?
Your love of the country and its institutions and culture is palpable almost. But you've also talked about how important it is to all your films to sort of show the warts and all. And
of course. I mean, that's what the stories are about.
As a result of that, and telling the full story that way, calling balls and strikes, as you say, have you ever been left shaken about the country or where it's gone?
I'm always surprised that what I thought I knew about a subject is actually so much richer and so much more complicated. Part of what's complicated about it is incredibly dark aspects of the human character that are true of human beings since the beginning of time in every place, and not just the United States. So it is not going to find from my lips a kind of wholesale sort of condemnation of things, because this is what human beings do. You will always find a good deal of shadows. The tapestry is not diminished in any way by lifting up that rug and sweeping out some of the dirt that often gets conveniently hidden for those same sanitized Madison Avenue superficial kind of views of American history. It never was like that, never will be like that.
So if you ever retire after your 150th film...
Can't retire.
What do you think you'll want your legacy to be remembered as?
Oh, just the films. I mean, I'm first of all, I'm the father of 4 daughters. That's the most important thing to me, and they're everything. And so first list father, and then second filmmaker, and then if these films have meaning, 10 years or 50 years or 100 years from now, that will be satisfying to know, but I won't be around to know that. So they will just be satisfying to the people who may or may not be satisfied.
Ken Burns is a documentary filmmaker. His latest work is The American Revolution, and it comes out this fall. He's written about his work in the Globe's Ideas section, which we will link to in the show notes. You can also find other articles about the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution in Boston Globe Opinion. We'll share a link. Thanks so much for joining us, Ken.
My pleasure, Jim. Thank you.
Say More is a production of the Boston Globe. Today's episode was produced by Anna Kusmer and Caitlin Harrop. Our engineer is Uzair Ahmed. If you like the show, please follow us and leave us a review at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email us at saymore@globe.com. I'm Jim Dow. Thanks for listening.